Most founders think investors only care about traction and numbers. But the truth is, your story and the way you show up matters just as much. I've personally seen founders win over investors in minutes just by sharing their founder origin story with total clarity and confidence. And it's been one of the biggest unlocks for the founders I've worked with in how we've raised over $250 million in fundraising. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to craft your origin story and deliver it so well that investors can't help but love you so fast that they end up investing into you. But before we get into how to actually do this, I want to show you why the founder origin story is so important, so you don't make the same mistakes as every other founder that I see constantly do when it comes to building a founder origin story and using it in the right way. What is that? Well, you treat it like a secondary thing instead of a main core part of whether or not you're going to get fundraising. And what happens then is, instead of you talking about yourself and the founder origin story, you're always talking about the business. Always, when someone says, tell me about the business, you go straight into talking about your business. And the problem with that is that you just become forgettable. You don't become someone that an investor instantly remembers and feels a connection to you. Because the founder origin story really does three different things amazingly well, and is the reason why it should be a main core part of how you talk about yourself and your company. So the first thing is, a big part of you successfully fundraising is you need to show investors that no one else is like you, and because of that, you're going to be the most successful. And what the founder origin story does is it sets you up as a one of one. It sets you up as someone who no one else can copy you, and you become instantly rememberable because they remember your story, not the data that you've tried to give away. Secondly, a big problem that comes into fundraising is investors inherently are thinking about you trying to just be transactional and selling yourself and constantly overselling yourself. Whereas if we actually use a founder origin story, one of the best parts about it is that it allows you to humble brag about your experiences. Because at no point are you then just trying to get the funding round done. You're talking about yourself. You're talking about your own experiences. And what that allows you to do is you can humble brag about your experiences that actually gets through to an investor and doesn't have that negative connotation and feeling that you're just lying to them to try and get them to invest. And thirdly, and this third one's a really big one, is it builds a personal connection. Fundraising is all about a connection with that person. In the meetings, it's going to basically be one-to-one, and you need to make whoever you're speaking to feel connected to you, because that's what's going to allow you to have better conversations, easier conversations, but also just a more natural trust-given aspect towards your meetings. And what the founder origin story does is, by talking about yourself, by talking about personal experiences, the investor instantly feels they know you a little bit more. They feel personally connected to you, and you can have those better conversations as you go through. So now you know why you need a founder origin story. Let me show you how to do this properly. So let's go straight into number one. The best way of explaining this to you is actually myself as a VC. As a VC, we had 100 plus portfolio founders and saw thousands of founders a year. And what happens instantly once you start to realize that as a VC and do all those experiences is there's that point you start to see what makes a great founder and what doesn't. Pretty much every single investor has gone through this same process, has seen the same kind of people that are successful and not, and have come to the same conclusion in terms of when they think of what a great founder looks like and what doesn't. And the most common trait wasn't just about experience, but was that the best founders knew exactly why they were building their startup, and usually had an event of why they were actually building it. Because look, you could have started anything. You could have stayed in your corporate job. You could have decided to go be a comedian. You could have started to be a surf instructor. You could have just decided, you know what, I want to be homeless for the rest of my life. You could have started a different tech startup, but there is a reason that you started this company. Why is that? And the best founders who successfully fundraise, but then also build exceptionally good businesses, they have deep clarity on why they're building their business. And there's usually a reason or an event for why they're doing it. So how do you build this out yourself? The first thing I want you to do is I want you to actually ask yourself, why are you building this business? And it's not going to be something generic. It's not going to be, I want to change the world. There is going to be an event or a single moment that made you realize that this is something that you want to do. Now, once we found that out, I want you to keep going backwards. Why did that event affect you? And keep going backwards as much until you find that singular event that you realize, okay, this is what started this. And this usually happens when you're 10, 12, 13, 14, 15. There are things that happen in your life that have caused you to decide that you want to go down the crazy route of entrepreneurship, that you're willing to do this, that you really want to build this out. And we need to find out what that is. So once we found out the deeper why, that's great and all, but then how do you actually show investors that you're good enough to actually build this and you are a credible founder? And that's what brings us on to number 2. So point number 2, when I first started working with Nick, he was very shy when it came to how he talked about himself. He was so scared about talking about himself and kind of just said random things in a very generic way about what he was doing and why he was building it. And what happened is investors just kept saying no, because they weren't really sure if he was good enough in the end. They kept pushing him on, I don't know if you're going to be the person to really do this. Once we look back at the recordings and we focused on what was going right or wrong in his founder origin story, what I realized is that he was never really talking about his own experiences. Now, he didn't have to have 20 years in the industry or anything like that. In fact, he didn't. There was at no point was he talking about actually what made him great and the experiences that he had. For him, what we realized is that he used to be an ex-pro golfer. And there was the reasons, it was partly one of the reasons why he was building his business. But as a pro golfer, these are all of the things that happened to him. Waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning just to hit 1,000 balls. The intricacies of having to go through a game and, years of not doing as well as he probably could have and just carrying on and persevering. These were the things that made him an absolute amazing founder. But at no point did an investor understand that. At no point did an investor know what it was like to be a pro golfer. And at no point did he talk about him being a pro golfer. So what we did is we flipped that. We started with that. We spoke about how great he was as a golfer and all of the things that happened to him. And within that, merged into how he'd become a great founder. You're never going to directly say, this is what makes me a great founder, but you want to talk about your experiences that makes an investor feel that you're going to be a great founder. And what happened at that point is he raised $4.19 million in total because of his experiences changing and because of him talking about how great he was and actually being specific about it. But how do you do this yourself? Well, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to write down what experiences do you have, both personal and also versus career. And then lastly, what insights did you get from them? And once we have all of those 3, we can go to the next step, because we've now got our deeper why, we've got the experiences that make you great. But then how do we actually build a founder story that makes sense and use storytelling frameworks that make investors actually be excited to want to speak to you? And that's really what brings us on to point number 3. So The Matrix is one of my favorite films ever, and I always love to use this as an example. Like most films, but The Matrix does it really well, is it drops you straight into the thick of it. If you have watched the film, it's when Trinity is being chased by the police and agents, and she just about luckily gets to the phone and then goes out of the Matrix. Now, imagine on the flip side if they didn't go straight into the thick of it, and they spent the first 20 minutes explaining the Matrix, explaining the history behind it and all of that stuff. Would you be excited by that? Think about stories that you've heard from other people and from your significant other or your friends or your family or whatever it is, and you've jumped in a conversation with them and they started a story and they give you all the background context. Well, 3 days ago Sally said this to me, and then we were driving over, and then this is the feeling that happened. What happens is you start to glaze over, you get bored, you're not really listening. And that's a big problem that happens with founder origin stories, is you're not actually getting to the point. You're not starting with the action, and you're not making them feel the emotions and the pain of why you're doing this. So how do you do this yourself? Well, you could have started anything, but you chose this. And what I want you to do is I want you to make sure that you're using a storytelling framework that puts you straight into the action and gives you an ability to talk about your founder origin story in the best way. And the framework that I like to use the most is the ABDCE framework. So what is the ABDCE framework? So it's action, something you experienced that made you take action in your company. So talk about that. Then you want to go into the background. So you want to provide context to understand how you came to the point. So you have to start to world build here. Then I want you to create the development of the story, right? So that's the body of your story. I want you to show the struggles and the character development of yourself to get to the point that you have. Really start to be vulnerable about why you're doing this. Make them feel the emotions, make them bleed. Then I want you to do the conflict, which is transformation. What was the transformation or event that finally made you decide it was time to start your company? And then the ending is what happened after the conflict event. How did that start your company? What did you learn from that? And that brings you straight back into how you can talk about your business. And once you have that framework in place and you start to add these in, at that point you'll have a well-functioning, storytelling-driven founder origin story that makes investors love you and want to invest. And that's great and all once we have this. But the problem is, how do you then make sure that what you're saying is correct and you're doing it perfectly every time? And that's what brings us on to the last step. So before Kimberly joined, she wasn't sure how she was speaking to investors properly. She thought she was doing okay winging it, but investors just kept saying no and kept saying no and kept saying no. And it was only after actually implementing a proper practice and method did she actually really hone into what was going right or wrong in her meetings. She started to realize that her tone was wrong. She started to realize that there were certain points in her founder origin story which she thought she was doing correctly actually just confused investors and didn't actually make them excited. And also within that, she started to realize the points in which she didn't like talking about, because that's a big part of it as well. It's also, how do you feel when you're speaking about the founder origin story? So what we did is as we did this, we started to iterate, we started to practice, we started to hone into what was going right or wrong. And at that point, she started to perfect her founder origin story and get much better at it. After that, what happened is she raised $1.3 million by practicing, iterating, and really honing into what made her founder origin story so good. And I want you to think about doing the same thing for yourself. When it comes to your founder origin story, and when it comes to anything really in a fundraise, practice and iteration is one of the most important things you can do. So you need to make sure you're doing that. There's only so much theory you can do that's going to get you to the top 1% of founders in the world. But how do you do this? The first thing I want you to do is I want you to actually record yourself. I know it's going to be weird. Look back at yourself and look and really understand if everything is going right or wrong. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to do something called record and review. So how record and review works is I want you to record yourself. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to turn the screen off and just listen to yourself. And what's going to happen, you're going to listen to yourself and go, oh, okay, why is it saying that? What's happening here? Then I want you to turn the volume completely off. And I want you to say, okay, what does it look like? How am I coming across? Am I being, monotone? Am I not really having any emotions? Like, what's really happening when I'm speaking? The third thing I want you to do is I want you to just transcribe it and I want you to read it. And then at that point, once you've done all those three, you can start to tinker and work with what you're doing. The last thing I want you to do is I want you to jump into actual practice calls with people. See how it's coming across. Only then will you really be able to understand what's going right or wrong. And when you look back at those recordings, by doing the recording review again and just creating a flywheel, will you only then be able to improve and improve and improve. Now, once you have this founder origin story, a big mistake founders do is they never use it. When an investor says, tell me about your company, every founder in the world just starts talking about your company and you get forgotten. So what I want you to do is I want you to treat this founder origin story as the first thing that you use every time. Even if an investor says, tell me about your company, I want you to say, before we talk about my company, let me tell you about myself. Because that founder origin story, one, it actually brings you back into your company anyway. But two, it makes investors remember you. It makes you one of one, and it makes you build the personal connection. And that's what's going to make you have the most success in the world when it comes to fundraising as a whole. But what about when you're in calls and investors start pushing you on things about your company? How do you master investor calls when you're doing that? Well, check out this next video where I go into detail about how to master investor calls and what you should be doing in every step.